All right. To start off our grand finals, let's welcome the judges. First, Gracia Prasetyani Utami from Universitas Prima Indonesia. Second, Jennifer Marceline Chen from Universitas Bina Nusantara. Third, Jonathan Prasetyo Johan from Universitas Katolik Parahyangan. Fourth, Marcel Jonathan from Tanjung Pura, an N1 from this competition. Next, Marvel Amadeus from Universitas Pajajaran. Marvin Tandi from Institut Teknologi Bandung. Nayara Syafa Kabila from Universitas Syah Kuala. William from STBA PIA. And last but not least, our chair, our very own CAP, Beauty Ariel Ben Yuwanto from Universitas Katolik Atmajaya, Jakarta. A stellar lineup of 9 judges that will be deliberating and deciding the fate of this year's Open Grand Finals. All right, as case building time has elapsed, can we please welcome the 4 teams who have made it into this year's Open Grand Finals of NUDC. Okay, in opening government, please welcome Universitas Udayana. In opening opposition, Universitas Hasanuddin. In closing government, Universitas Indonesia. And in closing opposition, Universitas Gadjah Mada. Before we start, for all 4 participants, please see that the timer is on the right side down there and you can see it there for any timing. Please make sure that you remain equitable in so far as this is live stream and it's going to be used for lots of debaters in future rounds to come. Ensure that your speeches reflect the quality of NUDC. Passing on the mic to our very own chair, Beauty Ariel.
Hello everyone, welcome to NUDC 2025's Open Grand Final. Congratulations to all 4 teams who have made it up until this far, making history, and one of you tonight will go home as NUDC 2025's Open Champion. Just so that we have a great debate that reflects what a grand final should look like, make sure that you comply to equity regulations, give and take POIs, give your best performance, and make this a speech you are able to remember for the rest of your career. Under the motion that reads, this House will implement plea bargaining into the Indonesian legal system, we call upon the Prime Minister.
Am I audible?
Yes.
In the current Indonesian legal system, everyone, regardless of the severity of their crimes, regardless of the context of their crimes, regardless of how the crime happens and the socio-economic conditions of those who committed the crimes, everyone goes into trial. How does the law in Indonesia manifest, and what are the backgrounds of it that makes everyone go into trial? It is based on the Indonesian law book, KUHP, which is the direct result of the colonization of the Dutch. So essentially, it's a law book of the Dutch translated into Indonesian with contexts which are specific to the colonial institutions, the European institutions that are brought over by the Dutch, which is not something that everyone can understand very, very well, especially in a developing country like Indonesia. The nature of the implementation of the sentence and the trial process is also brought over by the Dutch from the capitalist and colonial institutions that want to frame every criminal as the serving of trial and etc. Those are translated also into religious laws and religious sentences like Sharia, which is in the current state is primarily used for non-criminal cases or perdata, which I think still has the same problems. Its interpretation is very, very highly influenced by Dutch law because the formative process of establishing Sharia and religious institutions in Indonesia, like NU and Muhammadiyah, are brought over or started under Dutch institutions in the 1900s during the colonial era. I think that in the second context, it could be more dangerous because religious laws pertains more to the common problems of everyday people that they experience, such as divorce, such as financial settlement, inheritance, and etc. So, how does Indonesians react to this? Indonesians are mostly poor or middle class because we are a developing country, in which people perpetrate crimes because they are driven by needs and driven by adrenaline to continue their daily lives, which compared to the United States, which has more accessibilities and more capabilities for its people to commit less crimes, I think that eventually what happens is that most criminal cases in Indonesia are petty crimes where people have more incentives to do and because of their socio-economic conditions. This is also why the United States adopts the plea bargain system when they are newly independent from Great Britain in the 1700s because they think that it is also a solution to mitigate the problems brought over by the socio-economic conditions of the early United States, which are also developing. So what are the implications of the current law code? The Indonesian law code is based on a specific law book, which is KUHP. I have explained you before. So in every trial, I think the judges, the prosecutors, and everyone who is involved in the law process must consult and deliberate specific terms and conditions that allow them to make a thorough process on how the sentence will be implemented at the end of the day. It means that there is a more legal process. It is more costly for both the institutions who dispense justice and for people who are implicated in criminal processes. It means that people who are sentenced for stealing potatoes or grandmothers who are sentenced for stealing chickens or etc. have to contend and go through this entire lengthy and costly legal process. So I think that the accessibility is not there when you consider that most Indonesians do this because of petty crimes. So I think the first thing that we have to consider is accessibility and how it will be manifested in a plea bargain system. I think that eventually, when you consider the socio-economic conditions of Indonesians, this option allows people to consider a more suitable plea, which is more suitable to the processes that make them commit that crime, so they can consult with their lawyers better, they can go through the legal processes better, and they can consider what are the implications of them choosing this plea and what it will be what it will affect to them. I think it is also likely for judges to process cases better because they have more context, because the defendants have already pleaded this thing or that thing, so it gives them more context on how the crime is committed, why that crime is committed, and what the just sentence for that criminal should be, considering the socio-economic conditions of the Indonesian people. I think that it will eventually, yes, before 6.
Plea bargaining actually no process of context because you actually negotiate with the prosecutor, meaning the only way you can get context is through the process of investigation, through trial process.
Yeah, but consider that Indonesians have already committed the crimes because of their necessities. So they already know that this thing is wrong, but they can select what bargain that they want to be applicated to them, so they can consider, if I plead not guilty, it will be worse for me because this will imprison me or etc. compared to when they consider pleading guilty because they know that the crimes will be punished with less severity. For example, back into the benefit that I offered you, I think that it will be more likely to make the trial process more accessible because throughout the implementation of this system, there will be more context which is known in the Indonesian legal institution. For example, you have a previous precedent that one judge uses to sentence this crime, so that the people will know that this crime has been sentenced to this severity, so they can expect justice better and plea their bargains better. The second context that I want to bring you and the benefit is that I think that the Indonesian law does not stand in a symmetric. I mean, there are poor Indonesians and rich Indonesians. The poor people who cannot access the context, the best lawyers, all the implications that can make them withstand trial better compared to the rich Indonesians. So I think that a plea bargain system eventually will give more accessibility to these people so that they can eventually think what the implications of their crimes are and how they want themselves to be sentenced. It results in a more equitable process for these poor people who can plead guilty and sentences will be less severe. If this does not happen anyway, because the difference between socioeconomic conditions are still there, we think that at the very least, it gives more context to poor people to think about the severity of their crimes and how it will affect them in the future. And so I think that it will result in a more equitable judicial system in Indonesia. Thank you.
We thank the Prime Minister for that speech. To start opposition side of the House, we call upon the Leader of OP.
Check. It is audible? Okay. Sorry, my speaking. 3, 2, 1. The context of hashtag no viral, no justice proves that cases in Indonesia should go through all the process of trials, and it deserves, and it's the way we can gain justice in the status quo panels. The way we can prove to people that our criminal justice system are still functioning and how it protects and how it actually protects the vulnerable actors the most, right? This is the only way why plea bargaining should not be implemented in Indonesia, because court trial is the only way that we can gain justice in the context of Indonesia, right? What is actually the context of Indonesia then? I think that the context of Indonesian criminal justice system, where there are lots of corruption happening, for example, power imbalance and inequality happening, especially with the context of lots of people that don't actually get the justice that they deserve, and implementing plea bargaining will only worsen this inequality that already happens, right? I will prove to you as to why implementing plea bargaining is actually something that is not effective and is not strategic at all, and will only increase the ineffectivity, the inequality that is happening in status quo. But secondly, how does plea bargaining actually look like, panels? Because I believe that OG has not established this yet. I think that plea bargaining looks like there is a negotiation privately happening between defendant and the prosecutor. This is what happens in US and like New Zealand, right? Meaning that there is a private process immediately to sentencing and skip all the trial process and investigation, all process of court investigation. I think that the reason why court trials and have a really long process and have a really long investigation for months, for example, because you need to investigate lots of detail. You need to investigate every like bystander, for example. You need to really look at the case and see whether or not that these people are actually guilty and whether or not these people are innocent, for example. I think that this long process is actually needed, especially in Indonesia, where there's still lots of cases that's not proven and it's need lots of time to actually prove it through the court trials, right? But thirdly, I think that the burden of proof of OO is simple. Firstly, we just need to prove to you why plea bargaining is not that effective to implement in Indo, and secondly, how this can create how our status quo can create better effectivity. But before that, let's respond cases from OG then. I think that the whole case is only talking about effectivity and stability, right? And accessibility, I mean. I think that accessibility is symmetric already because it already exists in status quo. When you want to go to trial process, for example, if you don't have that good legal team, you can hire pro bono lawyers, or the court process is not that expensive because the state pay for it, right? To make sure that the court proceeding is that actually fair and done in the right way and in the right process. This is needed because this is the only way to see whether or not the crime actually that bad and whether or not the punishment should be like increased, for example, or whether or not the people are actually guilty, for example. But secondly, I think that kasasi and banding already exist in status quo. They need to explain to you why kasasi and banding after the first stage of court trial is not effective, for example, because if you are as a defendant think that it's unfair, you can still do kasasi and banding after that. So I don't think that plea bargaining is needed at the end of the day anyway, right? But lastly then, about the point of like effectivity, I think that I already told you, last when they talk about that process, that this can create better context because they like interview the defendant or whatever. No, what they do between the defendant and prosecutor is that you actually negotiate whether or not you want to plead guilty or plead not guilty, right? Meaning that they don't actually ask the context of everything because they only see that the premise of the crime that you made and they make sentence and reduce the sentence of that crime, right? But moving to my first argument and talking firstly, why is this backlashing with the purpose of CGS in Indo? Two analysis. Firstly, I think that in CGS, I think that the CGS process want to create fair punishment and process all through the process of trials to prove whether or not you are really guilty or innocent and how it shows that they have the way to actually investigate the case, right? What are the picturization then? I think that plea bargaining under their side, meaning that there will be private negotiation between defendant and prosecutor. What how this look like? A, with the context of CGS in Indo, people are most likely to plea, especially poor defendant, because there's a coercion process by the police and authority who wants the case to solve quickly, right? Meaning there is a process of intimidation where you don't really want to investigate this case and you want to just plead guilty so that you have less sentence, right? Why is this bad? Firstly, the process of court or trial proving guilty only exists without plea bargaining, right? It shows how investigation, how the process can really show who's innocent and who's guilty. This is needed because this is the step-by-step process to actually prove who is guilty and give fair punishment, right? But secondly, in scenario where victim is innocent, firstly, you are forced to plead guilty. This looks like the case of Sambo case, who framed his subordinate that he actually fired the gun, right? If this is plead guilty and you respond to plead guilty, this reduces the sentence, but it doesn't actually punish the right perpetrator, right? This is bad because it doesn't fulfill the process of CGS that should punish the real perpetrator and serve the status quo. But secondly, even if the victim is real, I think that it will still better with the real trial process because the punishment will be much fairer under orders of the house. Having this is only way that you can give real and fair punishment. But lastly, I think that social sanction will only exist when there is media coverage through the investigation process of court proceeding, right? Meaning that when the crime are publicized, when people doing like check and balance, meaning that at the end of the day, if the punishment is not that fair, if like a boss do like exploitation to his coworkers, at the end of the day, people can do like social sanction and actually check and balance that company. Why does he still work in that company, for example? And this is the way that you cannot go back to society and like prove that you can, and this the way that we can actually create like safe spaces for people, and this serve the purpose of CGS, right? Moving to my second argument then, how this can give better deterrence and victim closure. I think that the prerequisite to trust is if you really show the society that criminal justice system is functioning through the court process, because it's publicized, because media coverage is there with the cases of like the corruption cases, for example, or like all of that case, and this is what creates actually like proof that CGS is actually working, and this give people to instill back the trust to CGS that they actually protect us, right? But secondly, this will create better victim closure because the punishment is fair. If they say that at least they still get punished and victim closure is still served, it's wrong panels. Because victim closure will only be served when the punishment is effective, right? But secondly, I think that the victim is not only one, but it's larger and in the scale of impact. Meaning that if one person is exploited in workplace, meaning that the whole workplace feel not safe, right? And this is the way that you can only do check and balance through court trial process that actually prove that they are guilty. Under all those reasons, vote for Hasanuddin.
We thank the LO for that speech. Gentle reminder to give and take POIs. For the audience, we invite to make sure that you keep calm and quiet throughout the speech because this is a big aula that echoes. So please keep it to a minimum. To continue the debate, we call upon the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
One, law is not equal, it is fair. Means as long as you get a good lawyer, you can press more charges or even avoid more charges, since they got more access to book of law in the fundamental of civil law being implemented in Indonesia. Means trial as the only way for opposition to go upon a crime case is not equal for those who have less resources at the status quo, as this is very important since Indonesia have a wide gap of people earning because it is still a developing country, as trial process can take them into more charges because they face against someone's powerful, as they go scroll through the proof that have been made and make by this good lawyer onto an unpowerless individual. But also, not only wide gap of resources, there's also a less resources in Indonesia in terms of law team, i.e. less jury happening in status quo, etc. Means to assume that the opposition case, that every crime case goes onto a trial, means 1,000 of cases every day, or not. In the result of that, I think first, it's going to have a delay of cases for people who's not in power or their cases is not most important. But second, it is going to have an unmaximizes cases by saying that there's a few jury happening on the court, or even you're not going to get a good lawyer because the good lawyer is already rich and only cater to rich people cases. Putting this under your mind, it puts a heavy impact that put people into undergoing fear of uncertainty upon what will they get and what sentencing would they get, but also they got already more harm if they go onto a trial without a good lawyer, since the opposite lawyer can press more charges if they got more good resources. Fundamentally, they should not go onto all of the trial. Opposition alternative is not really that good. But moving on to the OO engagement, their entirety argument is only arguing about the plea bargaining is a negotiation, which means, so if you plead guilty, the deliberation of how severe your sentence should be happening in court. So we disagree on OO in inequality argument. In plea bargaining, the prosecutor and the defendant argues about how severe the punishment would be, more equitable for defendant, especially for the poor ones. If plead not guilty, then trial will be processed like OO wants, plus additional reconsideration because they do not want to admit guilt if found guilty. This mechanism ensure adjust step by step, like if they are pleading guilty, it means a discussion of how the sentence is severe and how is the reduction of the sentence. If not guilty, whether or not you committed and sentenced for dodging the truth. This is especially important given how colonial context in KUHP is not easily understandable towards ordinary Indos people that have no knowledge through law that deep. And closure happened through deliberation in both parties to find justice happening within the context of law that they are not familiar with. And this process is undergoing within a heavy supervision from the third party, for example, so there will be no intimidation or if whatsoever that they might say in the next cases. But before, to my contribution then, fundamentally, why plea bargain should be implemented? Fundamentally, why human commit crime consists of reason, maybe revenge, maybe anger, maybe envy, etc. I don't know. In doing so, a lot of adrenaline are needed as every human consciously know that they are breaking the law, so it needs a more of courage to do that. Means adrenaline is the coping of human to do that kind of things. Hence, in that time, in their way of thinking, is very irrational because there's a severe feeling of anger, for example, etc. But this lead into B. This is in doing crime, human goes into two stages. First one, where they have the high adrenaline, where they are irrational. But B, the moment after you do it, the adrenaline is decreasing down, you control yourself, and you are rational after you committing your crime. It looks like a post-nut clarity, but see, into this after process, where human is able to process what they just did, i.e. like as you can see in biography or even documentary-based film, that show how the main character realize a handful of blood after they commit some murder, for example, sorry, trigger warning, but this means in this kind of realization phase, human process their moral compass, human remember their norms, hence they contemplated after they are doing it. Means for them, there must be an option to admit their guilt before going onto a trial. They are wrong and they think they're wrong, but also it makes them not wasting time to go onto a trial because they know that they are guilty since they do it because of adrenaline, for example. But next, this also means for those who didn't know that what is their wrongdoings, i.e. for those poor people who doesn't know that they are breaking the law because the law is not so familiar with them, it is not complicated for the process as they having a less resources in the very first place. Closing.
So your case is not an argument to implement plea bargain. Your case is an argument to execute better understanding and educations of legal system in Indonesia.
I think that's not right because then plea bargaining is having the urgency to not to put education like you would have told. It is just to give people an option to go onto a simpler process of law because then the trial is not equal like I have told you in my opening cases. But then to the negative cases, why status quo and alternative are bad? A, we want to further push for a point of accessibility as negative cases that we think it's not enough. If you are going to say there are a lot of pro bono lawyers, etc., no, if the cases is too much under a country like Indonesia, we have a big problem. But B, alternative R is cara kekeluargaan that full of intimidation because no one have supervision or even there has a legal or even has any legal bindings of what the things that should do onto this process of kekeluargaan. Or also because but also because perpetrator directly faced against their victim in this way, it's lead to onto as emotional pushes because then you not should be doing a victim and perpetrator directly. It put a heavy bias to those in power to intimidate their other beings because then there is no third party that keep it conducive. But also, accessibility is also considering time efficiency because not everyone have a hard times to go undergoing into a trial. Means that they know they are guilty, they don't want to make it complicated. There should be an option for them. And lastly, what OG has established is the fundamental of Indonesian law, is why plea bargaining is the urgency because then not everyone having the time, not accessibility are proven. So that's why plea bargaining must be implemented.
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech. To close the opening half, we call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Two responses to opening government. First, I talk about the accessibility of justice insofar that there are poor people. Three reasons why this is false. One, this is highly symmetric because insofar if you want to procure a really good plea bargaining deal, i.e. the negotiation process, you still need a really good lawyer to make sure that your sentences are really low in comparison to what would have been given you originally. Means that in their side of the house, if poor people cannot necessarily access really good lawyers, means that there are marginal differences to whatever sentencing that they will get, whether or not they will admit guilty or not guilty. So I think this is symmetric and irrelevant to the entirety of the amount of sentencing that I will likely get in their side of the house. But secondly, the existence of restorative justice and its current glorification means that one, socio-economic factors are already highly taken into the account into the investigation process, but also the subsequent sentencing. Thirdly, the diversification of mechanism within CGS that we have right now. This looks like both psychological and socio-economic rehabilitation process. This like making sure that other than the formal prison mechanism that we have in our current CGS, we have things like seminars for poor people when they commit crime because of socio-economic reasons, means that they don't always necessarily go to prison in status quo. Thirdly, assuming it is expensive to procure lawyer, we think that is not necessarily important. We think that the expansion of legal aid that has been massively glorified and seen as an important organization within our CGS, that's why we are seeing them getting more funding over time, and the accessibility and the sort of opting in process of people seeing that the current justice system is somewhat flawed. That's why we get more and more legal graduates wanting to opt in into things like legal aid as opposed to just expensive law firms in status quo. Second response, I talk about the irrationality and therefore the admittance of guilt and why you should be given this type of choice. We think that is not true. This is not necessarily important insofar where the fact that prior to the crime being committed, the mens rea or the intent to commit a crime is something that should be punished in of itself. The fact that you are thinking and internalize the fact that you want to commit harm to someone else is something that should always be punished and deterred in their side of the house. That's why, for example, we still take into account people's intention to the crime when sentencing someone. Secondly, regardless of that, even if you are suddenly feeling remorse, the fact that harm is in of itself has already happened to someone else, there is an immediate need for reparation to the victim in of itself, not necessarily just for closure reasons, just for the fact that there is a negative utility that has been given to the victim that has to be repaired insofar where you are trying to benefit off of the fact that you commit illegal crimes. This is not necessarily an important principle within the legal system in of itself. I'm going to extend one thing. I'm going to talk about closure and transparency. But before that, some contextualization. What does the current CGS in Indonesia looks like and why we think the Indonesian justice system is good enough and have good status quo for defendants and status quo, whatever, regardless of their socio-economic status. There are three reasons for this. One, we said that the essence of Indonesian CGS is highly inquisitorial, not necessarily adversarial, meaning that the current justice system, the court in of itself, actively takes place into the investigative process, things like procuring witnesses and procuring evidence in comparison to like other justice systems that are highly adversarial. Means that you don't necessarily have to rely purely on your lawyer as a way to prove yourself that you are innocent. The court in of itself also take into that account in the process of trying to procure evidence and etc. Secondly, the robust variety of post-trial options, like my first speaker has already told you, that is to say that the ability for you to appeal the result of trial itself. People have the ability to appeal the result insofar that they believe that there are irregularities in the evidence, inconsistency with witness statements, for example, things like illegal means of trying to gain witness or evidence. They have the ability to continuously appeal the result if they sort of disagree with the result of the court in of itself. But thirdly, the fact that the court operates on the basis of beyond reasonable doubt, this means that most burden of proof will rest on the prosecution's shoulders to bring evidence. You have to prove that you have to go over the threshold of like beyond the reasonable doubt. Means that actually the court stacks for the defense counsel as opposed to the prosecution, because you have to prove 100% with certainty that someone is truly guilty as opposed to 100% guilty. Means that if just 1%, a sliver of doubt that this person might not be guilty, this means that they can just be found not guilty in our side of the house, insofar in their side of the house. Because the problem with the lack of ability to appeal, it means that when you admit that you are guilty, you cannot necessarily appeal the result and the sentencing. After that, that means that the impact towards things like recidivism and the fact that these people have to go to prison after admitting guilty means it gets worse in their side of the house. But before that, sure, okay.
Pleading doesn't mean you're free, means you admit that you are wrong and you get to say that and get something for realizing it.
Yeah, but you still commit harm to someone else, and that the fact that that person is innocent and the fact that you have the active intent to commit harm is in of itself still punishable. I don't understand why, just because I suddenly become religious or I suddenly have some degree of realization that I was evil, that's not important. You have committed harm and therefore still need to be punished. What does this mean? I think this cuts down on a lot of the urgency and of accessibility that happens inside opening government. Their problem or their argument upon the current justice system not being accommodative enough to people that has been accused of crime is completely untrue insofar where a lot of mechanism and the fact that our fundamental nuance and essence of the current CGS system oftentimes still protects innocent people above the prosecution in of itself. One extension then, we're going to talk about accountability and transparency and how this translates to things like closure of victims. The premise is simple. The fact that you remove the investigative phases of the current justice system, of the court that is inherently truth-seeking, to the context and the details of the cases itself, I think this actively dilutes the extent of catharsis and closure can actively get in their side of the house. I don't think catharsis is something that you get purely out of the outcome of the trial. I think the investigation process where every detail adds to how victims get their closure. The fact that I know how my husband or my son died, why did he have to die? Why did the person kill my husband, and etc. adds to the clarity and adds to the sense of control that I have when I try to internalize and when I try to reason with the situation where someone who close to me just died, for example. And I think this adds to this type of control and the fact that now I know what happens, because I think that lack of knowledge is what makes people cannot necessarily forget that traumatic experience. I think the fact that you know every fact and detail is how you get catharsis in our side of the house, why you get more transparency in our side of the house. I think regardless of what happens on whatever contextualization they give you, the fact that you go through an investigation process and the fact that our process of trying to seek evidence and the fact that you can repeal them means that people do have accessibility to justice in of itself, but people do still have accessibility to things like catharsis to the maximum fullest extent as opposed in their side of the house. We think that society should also be given the access to catharsis insofar where there are psychological fear of crime to society as opposed to just direct harm. For all these reasons, proud to oppose. Hear, hear.
We thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that speech that wraps the opening half. To start the closing half, we call upon the member of the government.
OG is a little bit reserved in this debate. Evidently, not all crimes are crimes of necessity, as OO correctly points out. Evidently, money also speaks on both sides. So the question in this debate is not whether or not we can achieve a perfect system of law, but whichever implementation of law provides a more general solution for individuals and is able to make use of the limited resources that Indonesia has. More generally, against OO, we will explain why the existence of the guilty plea solves a systemic issue with the legal system that prevents anyone from getting any form of justice, which is the existence of the legal backlog. But before that, 2 points of setup to crystallize this debate further. First is on the model. 3 points to note here. A, that we would implement this purely in national law, so any discussion on Sharia law or Adat law is probably out of this debate, and very likely that is implemented in criminal cases, so when somebody prosecutes somebody else for doing a crime. But B, that we give the option for the defendant to do this plea bargain, which means that it's not at all true that we force or pressure these defendants to take plea bargains even if they don't want to. And notice as well that there is also no appeal for the defendant defendant once they take that guilty plea. So it is actually a very sort of a substantial choice that they have to make that they will think through. But see, you also have laws to handle the misuse of guilty pleas by prosecutors. You have, for example, perjury. You have, for example, misuse of court that dissuades bad actors from misusing the existence of the guilty plea to just go willy-nilly and prosecute people because they will take the guilty plea. But the second point of modeling is that this can exist in tandem with other efforts that the Indonesian government is doing to make our legal system better, i.e. mainly about increasing the efficiency of the court systems and increasing the efficiency of things like investigations and things like that. We do not mean that this is then an admission of us not wanting to improve our systems. It's just that currently the rate that those things happen might be slow and would require space to make those changes happen. And it cannot happen insofar that the legal system is still too inefficient. So what CG will do to enter this debate is to prove two things. Firstly, that avoiding trials is something that's principally right and we owe it to not just the defendants but also the victims to have the option to do so. But secondly, that we're able to achieve a greater form of legal efficiency and therefore solve the systemic issues that the legal system in Indonesia faces. Firstly is why avoiding trials is something that is just and necessary to have. I will analyze this from two particular angles. First is from the angle of the defendant. I think what opening opposition necessarily forgets in this debate is that defendants are also human and they also deserve the same amount of respect within the legal system. And the reason that this is true is because there is no epistemic access for you to know that this defendant is someone that is definitely guilty, that you do not know that this someone is definitely committed the crime that you accuse them to, which is why we believe in things like due process. But more specifically in this debate and why the plea bargain comes into play is we believe in things like proportionality. That is, we do not believe in things like double punishment. The only punishment that defendants should get is the punishment of prison or the punishment of fine. They should not get punishments outside of that environment if it is possible for us to do so. And the problem with Indonesia's legal system is that in many cases that there is double punishment for defendants outside of these kinds of sentencing. That is to say, you have the mental punishment in the form of going through incredibly traumatic and stressful trials. Even if you are guilty, this is still a great form of punishment that's outside the scope of the court. But more specifically also, the financial punishment, how legal fees are astronomically high in Indonesia, of how many people do not have access to the funds necessary to afford a good lawyer, for instance, or are forced to do so and therefore go broke and cannot fund their family. We say that this is unjust to these individuals and we should give them that choice to opt out of this system if they feel that it is necessary for them to do so, and the plea bargain is the only way to do that. But secondly, that victims also feel it too if the process of trial goes too far. So insofar that this individual and this defendant has admitted their wrongdoing and takes that plea bargain, that's also beneficial to the victims' extent because they are able to get a quicker point to be able to move on. They're able to think about other things and not sit through that trial, which is also equally traumatizing to them. I know what opposition's reservations for this argument to be. Firstly, why is it right for us to reduce the sentences of individuals who are going to be guilty? And the reason for this is because the reason we accuse people and charge people for their crimes is twofold. Firstly is actus reus, which is the action that is being committed, and this will not change under both sides. But second is mens rea, which is the intention to hurt someone or commit that crime. And these two are punished separately under our legal system. I think the intuition for this is if I take a knife and I try to shank a chakal, but my aim is really, really bad and I miss, I will still get prosecuted and I will still go into prison because I demonstrated that intention to murder him. So therefore, given that these are two separate things, if we're able to demonstrate that we can mitigate the mens rea aspect of that crime, i.e. by guilty individuals admitting that they are guilty and that they deserve to go to jail, even if it's in exchange for then that's something that's just for us to then reduce their sentencing and reduce their punishment. I think the parallel to status quo is that when individuals confess their crimes to the fullest and show remorse, for instance, that we also reduce their sentences because we feel that they have mitigated the mens rea aspect of their crime. But secondly, what about wrongful accusations? First off, you cannot avoid that under either side of the house, given that our legal systems and our police systems are imperfect. But secondly, that the comparative is much worse under their side of the house, given that now you have to sit through the lengthy trial process, but also have to go through a variety of middlemen that who knows what can happen within that process. You have to go through the police, you have to go through investigators, you have to go through law firms. We don't know if any mistakes or, God forbid, any malice exists within that process that cause you to experience more pain than you have to. I think the weighing is the compromise of magnitude. The CGS is for everyone. Sure, maybe in some cases it's going to end up with a net loss for those individuals involved, but if we can make this better for most individuals in the general sense, then we're happy to take that trade-off. But secondly, in legal legal efficiency. I want to frame that there is a legal backlog in Indonesia for 3 reasons. One, that in general, law is just incredibly hard, incredibly long, because court proceedings obviously have to be as careful as opening opposition describes. But secondly, that because Indonesia isn't that efficient, police take a lot of time to do investigation, courts are rather slow in our country. But thirdly, that Indonesia is very dense. There are a lot of individuals, and often these places are very population dense, and therefore a lot of crimes happen, especially also because we're a relatively poor country, where, for instance, education is not that high, and therefore the amount of crime that happens is incredibly large. And the problem then is that we have a limited number of lawyers, we have a limited number of judges, and we have a limited number of courts, which means that in many cases, especially in the district or the city level, that a lot of the cases do not get dealt with at all, because we do not have time to cater to all of those things. And meanwhile, these new cases are coming and piling in every single day that we are also not able to cater to. And the impact of this is twofold. One, that you do not get good treatment of current cases, simply because you do not have the time to investigate them fully before you move on to other cases. We can see this happen with individuals and cases being dropped after a certain amount of time or left on the back burner for years on end and no justice happening. This immediately flips OO's benefit of due process, because it doesn't happen insofar we're not even able to cater to those cases. And also you get the competition of price with lawyers, because the only kind of lawyers that guarantee a speedy trial or a better trial are going to be those that ask for the most money from you, which is obviously not accessible for poor people. But secondly, that you also free up, you don't have the space and resources to implement improvements to the legal system, insofar that most of your lawyers and most of your judges are preoccupied with dealing with the massive storm of cases that come in every single day. We're able to solve this with the guilty plea, because people who are guilty can simply skip the whole process and give space to cases that actually matter for those that are innocent, for instance, and give them that. Weighing against OO, that's prerequisite to due process, and against OG, that's better in scale, and that's why you propose.
We thank the member of the government for that speech. To start closing opposition, we call upon the member for the opposition.
Fiat justitia ruat caelum. Laws are cures. What the government bench want is inhuman to the victim. When you are a victim of heinous crimes, when your loved ones are killed, when your house is robbed, the cruelest thing you could do is to rob the victim of justice. Instead of open trial, where victims are empowered, their stories are heard, they can look into the perpetrator in the eye and say, look what you have done to me. Government bench want to be for the cases to be decided in closed, smoke-filled room where lawyers and prosecutors and the police decide the punishment. When you are already harmed, the least you want to do is to make, the least you can do is to make justice open and flowing for you, to make sure that the perpetrator suffer as much as you already do. What the opening bench debate has provided us is a deadlock on corruption and inequality. Structural poverty would still exist because desperate people would still exist under both sides. Corrupt people would still exist on both sides. So this cannot be the tipping point. But even if these are your tipping point, like you need people who are desperate to be caught, so that to ensure that there is highlight on the issue, that there is an urgency for you to solve the problem, and this is why this current system must remain. CG come into the debate by saying that this will be unfair for the victims and this will be unfair for the perpetrators. We would engage directly with CG by proving that why trials are necessary and imperative to make justice for the victims, and prove that plea bargain would only overwhelm the Indonesian law system itself. 2 points of important clarification. One, where would plea bargain be implemented? three things, right? Sure, there is the petty crime issue, but there is also the conspiracy where you have to reveal your co-conspirators to get a lesser sentence. But also the third one is difficult cases where it is hard for prosecutors to prove according to the standard of the criminal court, which is beyond reasonable doubt, meaning the vast majority of cases will be tried using the plea bargain policy, right? This is why 95% of United States crime case never went to court. They all ended in plea bargain. How it worked how the plea bargain worked? Simple. They would investigate and they would negotiate, right? They would negotiate with the perpetrators. This is done by the police and prosecutors, not the victim. Why? Because A, it is not that's called restorative justice if you want it to be done by the victim. And secondly, for it to work, the perpetrator must already be captured, meaning the actor with the most access to the perpetrator are the police, and therefore they are the one who is going to do it. And thirdly, it is going to be finalized by the prosecutor. Moving on to the case. Firstly, on victim protection and justice. Let's imagine for a second that you are a victim of a crime. What would you feel? You would feel madness, but at the same time, you would feel powerlessness. Why? Because you have no resources to catch, to prove the perpetrator, because you're just an individual. You would feel emotional because of the anger. You don't care about principles such as innocent until proven guilty. If you could, you would beat them up, and then you also would commit a crime, meaning that you need external and legal help. Help in this case comes from the trial process, where the prosecutor will make the case for you, the judge will decide for you, and in the criminal system itself is open for public. You can see how it all unfolds. You can torment the perpetrator to make them suffer as much as you. This is something that is exclusive, because in plea bargain, what you aim is quickness and swiftness, to ensure that everything will be done quickly and taking as little resources as possible. This process will be closed. The prosecutor will do less to actually make the case, just enough to scare the perpetrator, or maybe none at all, because the perpetrators know that they already did it. The comparative under their side is that victims will be left out. You cannot see justice for yourself. This is important because you rob them out of potential closure that they should have got. In our case, where you are able to see it yourself, you are able to judge how the court goes, to open the case for the social media, where you are going to make people on Twitter viralize your case. In their case, you cannot do that. Secondly, you would worsen the confidence issue, where the Indonesian criminal justice system are less trusted under your case, where people are less likely to report their case to the criminal justice system, and increase the lawlessness and increase the potential of them taking the justice for themselves through the powers of mafia or something like that. Thirdly, the inherent goal of plea bargain is for you to have lesser charge, meaning that you are going to reduce the victim's closure, that all of their suffering would only mean 6 months of prison time. Before I move on, yes, closing.
They overgeneralize what victims want, but moreover, they have not established why the comparative is necessarily better insofar the legal backlog still exists.
The legal backlog would still be exist, which I will prove in my next case, why the due process will be ensured better in our case. And furthermore, on the victim themselves, they are most likely going to be the one who is powerless, and therefore you need the resources to help them to ensure that. But at the same time, you have to make sure that the victims can check and balance it, only happen in closing opposition bench. Lastly, on due process, why it will be ensured. Firstly, check and balance in the court system. There are going to be more people to be involved, where police and prosecutor and judges all will be involved, and it all will be open to the public. Therefore, there is less likely for you to have mistakes to happen. There are less likely potential for mistrial to happen. This is the prerequisite of OOS analysis analysis on why the criminal justice system is working fine. But secondly, plea bargain would only topple the criminal justice system because that only works based off equal responsibility. What will happen under their side is that you would add the responsibility, not for the police, not just to investigate and capture, but now also have to decide. You would overwhelm them to the point that they are unable to have more resources to ensure the public peace, and therefore people would most likely feel unsafe because the police are too focused at proving the guiltiness, the plea bargain in and of itself. And therefore, after 3 years of attempting and 4 years of attempt, with gratefulness to everyone that has helped, I can finally say, proud to represent Gadjah Mada in NUDC final.
We thank the member of opposition for that speech. To wrap up closing government and the entirety of GovBench, we call upon the government whip.
Is this an okay volume? Okay. CEO's contribution to viral justice is not something that's new in the debate. Therefore, I don't think they already added an actual meaning of what their contribution currently is. Currently, I think OO has already done a better job on mechanizing what is the urgency on how to solve this, and they quite already established a mechanization anyway. Therefore, what I will do in my speech is to contribute on why, even if the current cases is unfair, why in the other output on the future we'll get better cases on comparative to make sure that people will be enjoying much more fair cases and trial to have more choices. Therefore, the first thing that I will ensure in my contribution is why legitimacy of plea system that can make individuals have more options is going to be beneficial on both opposition side scenario. Because judge, what we need to realize is that no fair and no justice is a form of legal failure in Indonesia, right? Hence, the core burden of bench of how necessarily it's going to improve significantly with the absence of plea system. Therefore, insofar they cannot mechanize why it's going to be better, I don't think they cannot win this debate. How are they going to engage with this? One, I think no justice is going to be a situation that signals most individuals cannot stand up on trial anyway. And this is unique to Indonesia's system that because they're likely to know what probably their chances of going on the trial is. How so? Because the chances of codification that they can access in Google or how they can access in KUHP already exist. Because the comparison on opposition is people being pressured on trial either way, whether they're guilty or not, knowing that probably I'm not actually guilty, I'm actually guilty, and probably try to backlash on that. They're facing a sentence that will separate them with their family, and they're forced to do so even if they can have the chances to acknowledge a lesser sentence. This means their claim is not going to be making any justice. Insofar they did not address why it's going to be proportional on their side, because know that particular sentences of petty trials is currently so high. They got 5 years of making just stealing a potato. I think this is why in contribution-wise on beating government, we already crystallized the impact of what OG mechanism is, insofar that they did not manage to break the deadlock on why it's going to break a lot of cases. But second thing, even if you want justice through virality, your fate is going to be dependent on people's sympathy or lawyers that are going to seek on pro bono cases, on people that want to donate you to make sure that you can get off that particular problem. This is why, insofar they cannot recognize on how people will actually donate and help them, I don't think they can escape their cases, right? Because this is the burden that's important to establish. And our comparative judge creates an independence where this is something that can exist whether they actually need to help, need an external help or not. And this is good. Remember that this will not be something that overused, insofar that people can rationalize their decision first. This means that the moment that they can see a hope and they get good enough lawyer, I think they'll have better chances to fight in court trials anyway. Because the comparative becomes, there's still a chances of me getting no sentences at all versus like lesser sentence. I think people will optionally choose the better one to have no sentence, right? I think this is better than their best case that even if they were able to get sympathy and trial, probably their chances are uncertain to win that particular trial because you do not know why on how the middleman will process of it. This is what my member contribution are going to entail with this. How do we weigh this? To OO in particular, to both opposition benches, we establish why independency of faith that exists in the victim can exist independence because we need to acknowledge what the current failure of the justice to make sure that we can have much more mitigation of a particular harm. And second, this is relevant to the particular context of this. But second, we need to make sure that the gravity of the situation that enables people, that make people unable to access a good justice is going to be important to be prioritized. But second contribution then is to make sure why establish the grounds on this particular debate, on why legal case in Indonesia are actually like that bad. Because Judge, we acknowledge that probably the constitution is going to be inclusive, but that's not going to be the case because it's dependent on what people going to interpret it. This means that people with different views that exist within the law enforcement cannot decide what can actually I want to do with this particular view because this is a big, therefore, there is a mismatch problem. If you want to have an identification of whether the constitutional law exists, because it's the law enforcement that is highly inconsistent in the situation. The comparative that exists on our side is a protection mechanism to mitigate the inconsistency of the law, that we want to protect racial people or racial stereotypes of type stereotypes that exist that for the wrongful accusation. I think this managed to at least make the better side to be like much more protected. The comparative on their side, they validate what is the bad law, the worst side of the law, right? But the faulty system will never get acknowledged. In so far, people don't have incentive to change in the other side based on the problem of legal bad law. I think this extends the response of OG. And so far, they never actually managed on how to protect this particular vulnerable actor. We mechanize on how to actually protect this. But how does this are going to also end on our side? Because like the cases on opposition, the cases of legal deadlock is going to be massive. There's petty crime exists in Indonesia where people are stealing of necessity. You cannot do, judges and like all already legal enforcement cannot do a beneficial evaluation to make sure what is wrong with my current situation on how what is the faulty law that exists. Because like probably want to rush the investigation. They will do rush trial because I have another trial after this. This is the rationalization that comes into their mind the moment they face like every crime. The delta that they established in this debate is that through the fact that expert and law enforcement can exist, they are able to do a lot of situation. Because now court procedure is much more quicker because they can simply dismiss like cases that are petty. It's also like a better treatment of future cases, of current cases that are probably much more important. Therefore, they will get much more fairer proceedings in so far they probably what happened in opposition. What does this mean? We flip the all to opposition due process based its dependency on what you are actually able to do yourself. How is it going to work? On against OO, we establish to you that the treat to due process is going to be harmful because it's going to full of sensitivity. I think we have mechanized why it's going to be a bad thing. But simply against CO on their contribution, what we established in this is that our comparative that managed to establish why the faulty of law system is not going to be something that's so hard, so easy to change. And so far, they never mechanize what is their comparative. And so far that on CG, we mechanize to you why people are able to rationalize and at least being mitigated under the process of law through the adding mechanism of protection proud to close on government.
We thank the government whip for that speech. To wrap this debate as a whole, we call upon the opposition whip.
Check. Okay.
Okay. I'm gonna start in 3, 2, 1. The thing that I'll do in this speech is very simple. I'll just completely dismantling every single assumptions that government bench made in this debate and positions Jason extension as the winning arguments. Panel, in any of the criminal justice debate, the key words that you should understand is you should perpetuate enough changes, not too extreme and not too soft. Either enough or proportionate punishments, or at the same time manifesting structural changes that prevent crime to happen because of things such as poverty and etc. I'm not going to be as stinky and greedy as what opening oppositions did, because they assumes that every legal system have the ability to catch every single perpetrator and putting them to trial. I'm going to engage with the government bench, assuming that legal system is imperfect. What government bench created is a massive illusions as if everything is working fine that prevents revolutions or reformation law system to happen. Because now you don't really have the incentive to tell people about law, about OITE, to create social discourses about things such as OOTPKS, because everything is working fine. Every single perpetrator confess their sins to their crimes. Or second of all, you don't really have the incentive to push another stronger bill to perpetuate stronger punishment because you think like the court system right now is enough. Because every single decisions or every single perpetrators are taken away by the police. And you don't really have the incentive to create structural changes such as building more jobs, such as providing jobs, giving direct cash aid to people, because you think like you do not really need this because every single crimes have been catch off. Therefore, you don't have the incentive, you don't give the incentive for government bodies to actually help the legal system. Because in order for government bodies to inject more money or more resources, you must have flawed legal system. Legal system must show that they cannot be perfect all the time. There must be things such as unresolved and ongoing investigations. There must also be a longer process of investigations, because government bench considered the main reasons why all crimes happen is because of petty crimes, because there are problems and there are structural problems that are not resolved yet on their side of the house. Therefore, this is the main reasons why you actually need our solutions, because there are victims that still need rehabilitations and therapy that could only be done when Ministry of Health actually inject more money to help legal system. There are thousands of jobless individuals that still need jobs that needs the helps coming from Ministry of Economy to inject more money to help legal system. Therefore, CGS should not be perfect. It should be flawed for other ministry, other government body to incentivize to provide jobs and cooperate with victims rehabilitations, or for Ministry of Education to teach about morality so that we can prevent crime much more aggressively. Our extension definitely beat opening oppositions, because it might be true that not every victims wanted longer punishment as what both government bench considered, because not everyone is that vindictive as what opening oppositions said. But in any instances, we say that in order for you to help victims to recover from their trauma, which we consider as the most vulnerable actor here, you need other government bodies to inject the resources and probably solve the indirect factors of petty crimes. The responses that we got from two government bench, especially from closing government, are to say that we must give choices from defendants. But number one, I do not really know whether this is true or not if there was an unproportionate punishment in the status quo, because you still have options to gain things such as graduation or amnesty to receive light punishment. But the problem is, once more, you need to be enough to ensure that the light punishments are given to the right individuals. But we think if you only make the barrier become significantly lower to get punishment just by confess to the people, that shows that you have no commitment at all, while maintaining the higher threshold to change are very important for defendant, because this shows that defendants has commitment to do better, has changed. So therefore, it's very important for you to maintain the longer process in jail, because in order for you to know that you have changed and convinced people, you must have the supervisor to monitor you. Therefore, this is the main reasons why having minimum threshold of receiving punishment as if it is something that easy, it's obtained on their side of the house. Not only that, in closing government, it is principally wrong, because as an individual and as a perpetrator, you are not committing fault to victims, but you're also committing fault to society. Because now if the barrier to get the light punishment is that easy, society would be scared when serial murderer outside only get 2 years of punishment, for instance. Therefore, there's an urgency for society to incapacitate these individuals more, because they are afraid if its individuals are still going anywhere, or if they receive less punishment, they cannot do anything. The wrong assumptions that government bench made is that we need to actually let let these people as early as possible, because this comes within the consequences of letting the variable of protecting the people, because this is mutually exclusive with the longer sentences. Once more, the keyword of these motions is enough. In order for you to not perpetuating rioting in the street, shame the individuals or the perpetrator even more to the double punishment like what closing government said, you need to ensure that your criminal justice system is enough. When you want to perpetuate reduced sentences and give that to perpetrator, you need justifications and stronger justifications why you want to give that to individuals, which only could be happen when you have longer sentences, because now you can explain to publics why we actually wanted these people to go early, especially in Indonesian court system where most of the where most of the courts are going to be transparent. You can see all the file reports on website or anything else. So therefore you have to back your opinions by ensuring that you have longer time to supervise the perpetrator. Closing.
So the problem with that is that more government investment at the start of the speech is something that is new, and surely wouldn't we invest in a process that was cheaper and that gave us more benefit because the relative sort of ROI is better?
So even if that's not cheaper, but that give urgency to changes in our side of the house, because obviously the structural changes are not cheap and it's expensive, and we admit that. But the problem is, in order for you to completely change society, reduce the incentive for people to do crimes, you need to change. But second of all, if we do not show that the commitment for these individuals to change in society does not really materialize, people would feel even more insecure, because we do not really know whether the perpetrator that receive lighter punishments are the people that have the incentive to change or not. Therefore, this gives the incentive for society to do double punishment as what closing government did. That makes the punishment become much more unequal. Lastly, CG said that the defendants do not want to go to trial because there are pressure from richer ones. This is symmetric in either side. But the problems are when the police have more power to seal the plea bargains immediately, you also added more pressure for the victims and defendants, because you also have the pressure from possible prosecutor, from society all the time. This is what makes it worse in their side of the house, because you added more pressure to defendants. This is the reasons why Jason analysis become important, because it's important to keep police neutral. Their main job is just to investigate whether you're guilty or not to, and then bring that to trial, not to add more pressures to the defendants in the first place. But second of all, there are also reasons why trial must involve public, right? Because if in either side you receive more pressures, you have the ability to speak up immediately to public, right? That there are something wrong with the police, there are something wrong with our defendants. We have been pressured since the very first place. So what exclusive from trial is, as victims, we have the ability to speak up, and that's give the incentive for victims to actually speak up. Because in a lot of situations, all the three teams conceded that there is an ongoing inequality. If we provide victims with safety net of the courts and public accountability, that's what make victims have more power to do something in the current status quo. Oppose.
We thank the opposition whip for that speech, and that wraps up NUDC 2025's Open Grand Final. Congratulations to all 4 teams for your performance and for your speeches, and we will look forward to seeing you in the closing ceremony tonight.